CNN's Angus Watson is following the story for us from Sydney. And Angus, clearly Serbia says the tennis champion is being held captive. His parents say he's being treated like a prisoner. But the Australian government say he's just like any other immigrant coming into the country without the right paperwork.
That's right. This has caused quite a stoush between Serbia and Australia. Serbia's called in the Australian ambassador in Belgrade. The embassy here for Serbia in Canberra has made representations to the government. The leader of Serbia has also spoken out about the treatment of its star player. Where he is in an immigration detention facility in downtown Melbourne. Quite astonishing to think that the world's #1 men's tennis player is there in this detention centre for days now at least, because it's not until Monday until the court will again resume to hear Novak Djokovic and his lawyers plead for an injunction against his deportation, a deportation ordered on Wednesday night local time after he'd spent hours in the airport trying to prove that he had the correct medical exemption from being fully vaccinated. We just heard there from Rafael Nadal that if Novak Djokovic wanted this all to go away and wanted to contest the Australian Open, he could have just gotten vaccinated. Here, politicians in Australia, including the minister who's in charge of borders, says he has another option. He could just leave. Here's what she had to say today.
Mr. Djokovic is not being held captive in Australia. He is free to leave at any time that he chooses to do so, and Border Force will actually facilitate that.
But there are other people within that immigration detention facility, Lynda, who don't have the choice to leave if they want to. There are 33 refugees in that hotel-turned-detention centre with Novak Djokovic. There are crowds of people, there have been crowds of people all day today pleading for people to listen to their plight too. Some of them caught up in Australia's immigration detention system for years now, in limbo, not knowing how long they'll have to remain there, because Australia has these strict border policies. It says that if you come here as a refugee by boat, you won't have the option to stay. So these people have been stuck there for years, including a person who served in Afghanistan as a translator with US forces, a Rohingya from Myanmar, and several people from Iran and Pakistan as well, Lynda. So Novak Djokovic has a few more options than some of the people sharing his accommodation.
Yeah, he certainly does. We will wait and see how that appeal plays out on Monday. Angus Watson for us in Sydney. Thanks very much. Well, Ben Rothenberg is the senior editor at Racket magazine and joins us from Melbourne. Good to see you again. So I want to understand, Ben, from your perspective, in Melbourne, what the feeling is there, given Melbourne had one of the longest lockdowns in the world as a result of the pandemic. Is his case getting much sympathy?
Certainly wasn't initially. There was swift and immediate anger and resentment when the news that Djokovic had been granted an exemption was put out on social media by Djokovic himself before his trip. There was a lot of resentment towards someone who they saw as seeing himself, fairly or not, as above the rules and trying to cut corners from things that people here have done in order to try to bring the pandemic under control as much as possible. There's been a widespread vaccination acceptance here. There's been long lockdowns people have abided by, and Novak Djokovic became sort of this perfect avatar for all sorts of frustration to be directed at, as someone coming in from outside for a relatively frivolous purpose of a tennis tournament, in their view, and not following the rules on the way to do so. It was really quite a firestorm that was brewing here. Now that he's facing consequences for having an application for his visa that getting rejected and not being able to get into the country, and he's being held in a detainment center, which he is free to leave the country and leave, but there is some more sympathy, I'm sure, for his plight, just on a human level, of being a person stuck in a room he doesn't want to be in, whether it's at the airport or now at this detention facility. But overall, I think that his arrival here was definitely not popular and stoked a lot of resentment that politicians were quick to recognize as being potentially expedient for them to try to support.
Yeah, I can certainly understand the frustration in Australia, but I can also understand the frustration from his family, from his team, who thought they did all the right things. They thought they had this medical exemption. But I have to wonder why Tennis Australia, who approved his exemption, didn't speak to the federal government, knowing that this could cause an issue when he arrived into the country.
Yeah, I think that's sort of where the remaining questions and sort of accountability needs to come from right now is Tennis Australia. How did they manage, it seems like, to mislead Novak Djokovic so much into thinking that he was in much better shape than he really was when it came to his status in Australia. They granted him an exemption, and he seemed to think that that was a done deal, that he'd be able to get into the country. But at no point, according to what we know at this point, did they really run that by federal immigration officials to let them check that it would be valid enough to get in and that his reasons would be enough. And then once he announced his exemption, it was news to the federal government, and they really started to scrutinize it far more than they probably would have otherwise. We don't know exactly if his exemption would have passed regular scrutiny just at the airport, but under the intense national spotlight he was in, they found it definitely lacking, and he couldn't produce any documents at the airport in the 8 hours he was held there to bolster his application enough to get him across the border.
Yeah, exactly. So if this appeal fails on Monday and he's not allowed to play in the Australian Open, what is this going to mean for the Grand Slam?
It means that the tournament will go on. The Grand Slams are still big tournaments. They're not relying on any one player to sort of carry them or make them relevant. They're historic events that have a lot of prestige with or without Novak Djokovic, but it will make it competitively a lot more wide open. He was a huge favorite to win his 10th title here, go for an all-time record men's 21st Grand Slam singles title. And now lots of other players will, if he is indeed out of the picture, will like their chances a lot more. People like Rafael Nadal, who's tied with Novak right now, along with Federer, with 20 Grand Slams overall. Nadal is here, not in perfect health, but he's here and competing and seems to be in good spirits, and he would like his chances a lot with Djokovic out of the field. Also, the recent U.S. Open champion, Daniil Medvedev, who beat Djokovic in the final of the U.S. Open, and is the world number 2, I think probably would move into this slot as being the favorite to win it without Djokovic in the mix this time.
Yeah, and from what we've heard, he hasn't got a lot of sympathy from some of the players in this tournament. And as we've been discussing, Australia has had some of the toughest restrictions in the world. And right now, cases there in Australia are surging, right?
Oh, yes, they are. Now, there's a big spike in cases. They're breaking all sorts of records during the Omicron wave. It's really the first wave of the pandemic that has hit Australia with full force. They've done a really great job of keeping COVID out and being near COVID zero for much of the pandemic. But this wave has overwhelmed them. It's breaking through even with vaccinated people. Long lines at testing centers. They're running out of at-home testing kits. The frustration of many in cities like Melbourne. It's been tough here, and that's the backdrop through which this resentment for Djokovic is probably higher than it would be many other places in the world at many other times in the world. It's sort of a perfect storm that Novak and his plane arrived into, and it was clearly not a smooth landing for him here.
Exactly, especially as Sydney is already looking to roll out more restrictions. All right, we'll leave it there for now. Ben Rothenberg, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lynda.
We're still ahead on CNN Newsroom. A blistering attack from US President Joe Biden. We'll tell you who he says is holding a dagger to the throat of American democracy. Plus, a new Homeland Security memo reveals the growing number of threats to US lawmakers, how Capitol Police are responding. We'll have that story after the break.